In the recent days, false information has been spreading online, wrongly linking the His Holiness 14th Dalai Lama to the Epstein file. This comes at a time when there are growing concern about organized online disinformation campaign across a different digital platform. To examine what is true and what is false, how such a misinformation spread, how it can be countered, we are joining with Mr. Lobsang Gyatso Sither. He is a member of Tibetan Parliament-in-Exile and Director of Technology at Tibet Action Institute. Lobsang, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Kestimula.
Lobsang, the name of His Holiness Dalai Lama was first reported as being mentioned in an Epstein file by the Russian state media on February 1st, 2026. So what exactly was saying in that report and how it began to spread online?
So I think the Jeffrey Epstein files, right, was released by the US Department of Justice on January 30th, right? And then the Russian state media basically had a misinformation or so basically they had a misleading title in their report, which actually says that Dalai Lama met with Jeffrey Epstein. However, if you look at the report, it actually talks about an email that somebody sent to Jeffrey Epstein, basically saying that he was going to a public event of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So this was a very purposely done misinformation campaign by the Russian media. And I do feel like this is something that was, if you think about like the context of it, right? His Holiness the Dalai Lama was given the Grammy Award on February 1st for the spoken word. So this was in conjunction with this, because if you look at the global news narrative, everything was about how His Holiness at the age of 90 received a Grammy Award for the spoken word in these times. So when that news was being shared globally, this was something that was done to basically misinform the public, but also to try to take away the news about the Grammy Award. So I feel like this was done as a strategic campaign, basically to malign His Holiness and also to take the news away from the Grammy Award. So, and if you look at this, so the timeline and all of that. However, what is also important to understand, right, based on my research of the fact that like the Russian media, which basically said like His Holiness the Dalai Lama was mentioned 169 times in the Epstein report or Epstein files, which was released on January 30th, I actually looked at the data. And when I searched for the data, if you search for the data by saying the Dalai Lama, you will only find 154 references. And if you just write Dalai, you'll find 166 references. So the question is like 169 references is also a bit harder to find exact number. So, but let's not quibble about the numbers, right? At the same time, if you actually look at the references that was made, none of the references have any direct link between His Holiness the Dalai Lama or the office of His Holiness the Dalai Lama with Jeffrey Epstein, or anybody that represents His Holiness with Jeffrey Epstein. And this was a statement that is also released by the private office of His Holiness the Dalai Lama today on February the 8th. So if you look at the whole context, there is no evidence, there is no information, whether it is part of the release list or any other photographic evidence that His Holiness the Dalai Lama has ever met Jeffrey Epstein, or there have ever been any communication between the representatives of His Holiness or Jeffrey Epstein. So there is no information like that.
So, Lobsang, if there's no evidence linking His Holiness Dalai Lama to the Jeffrey Epstein, why does his name appear in some reference connecting to the recently released Epstein-related document?
So if you look at the recently released documents by the US Department of Justice, they actually released 3.5 million pages of documents. So we have to understand the context. So when they released 3.5 million pages of documents, right, and if you look at the documents and if you just do a basic search, right, and I looked up the name of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and as we know, it was referenced about 154 times, right? At the same time, if you look up the data and you write the Pope, the number of references to the Pope is 421 times. And if you look at Martin Luther King Jr., who has already passed away, the references there are mentioned is 352 times. there was no way that Martin Luther King Jr. has ever met Epstein, right? Or any relation, because Martin Luther King Jr. has already passed away. So just one context, right? At the same time, if you look at Epstein and Obama, like if you just look at the reference of Obama, Barack Obama, it was referenced about 2,460 times. So being named in the list has nothing to do with the relationship. And so this is something that if you look at the global media or reputed media organization, all of them always state one thing. The name being named in the Epstein list or the documents that has been released has nothing to do with the relationship or not. So I think that understanding of the context of what that means. So for example, I looked at the 154 references or name of His Holiness the Dalai Lama that was referenced in the recently released files. Out of those, 20 to 30% of those references are actually mailing list emails. So for example, like if you're doing an event, like if, for example, if you register to a news organization or a news media, when they publish news reports, they send out all these news to a mailing list, or as part of you subscribe to a mailing list, right? Ask any Tibetan organization, what do we do? Anytime there's something happening in Tibet, we send out a blast email to everyone. So if you look at the list, about 20 to 30% of that is a mailing list. So anybody can register to a mailing list. That doesn't mean any relation or any contextual, right? At the same time, out of those, about 30% of the emails, there's some emails that reference His Holiness Dalai Lama. But if you look into the details, there are some of the emails have been referenced like around 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 times. So it is one email that is being referenced multiple times. So that is also something that we need to look at. And if you look into the data even more, there are resumes of people with no context. So it's a resume of somebody who actually says like, it's maybe 4 or 5 pages of resume of a few individuals who are like talking about their work. And as part of their work, they talk about how they have actually worked on something about His Holiness. So this is just, basically they're trying to show their credentials. So it's just a resume. And in the resume, if you write His Holiness, that doesn't mean anything, right? That doesn't really reflect that you're connected to this. At the same time, in the email, there are actually emails from journalists who are actually trying to get an interview with Epstein. And as part of their interview or part of the email or their correspondence, they are actually talking about their own credibility. They are talking about how they have interviewed numerous notable individuals, including His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So these are the references within that structure. And out of that, there's only about 30% of that which references some emails. And the emails, for contextual purposes, refer to His Holiness only in terms of like the context that maybe they are going to an event, maybe they have listened to His Holiness, maybe they are sharing an article of His Holiness. There is no evidence, there is no information in the recently released documents that ever mentions His Holiness the Dalai Lama meeting with Jeffrey Epstein or any communication between His Holiness representatives and Jeffrey Epstein.
Lobsang, from your understanding and research, did China's state-linked media outlet or the coordinated social media network play a role to amplify this kind of narrative? If so, how does this coordination usually work?
Yes, so this is my opinion. I do feel that there was some coordination and also somehow the Chinese CGTN or Chinese state linked medias or individuals amplified this. So there's two different aspects of how I look at this. The first thing is, why did RT first came out with this article? If the Chinese CGTN actually had come out with this article, it would be like, because His Holiness has just received the Grammy Award, so they would be trying to do this. So people would not even look at it, right? So this is a coordinated campaign where they actually kind of started with Russian state media instead of the Chinese state media. And then the Chinese state media started linking to the Russian state media. So this is a coordinated campaign, right? And as part of that, then you can also see a number of Chinese government supporters or people who don't like the Western world, who don't really like the US, who don't like Epstein, start kind of like sharing this misinformation and without actually even looking at the data. So that's one part. The second part is, I think, how this was also amplified is people are hurt because Jeffrey Epstein was a pedophile. Jeffrey Epstein was a multimillionaire who really abused women, who really abused his power. And there's so many people who felt that he was such a bad person, and they're not even reading the articles. They're just sharing something because they're like, oh, this person has done so many things. So anything that's related to him, they're just sharing it. And then that's how it also gets amplified. So in terms of amplification, I think there are two parts of it that we really need to understand. The first one is the fact that this was a warfare that was led by the Chinese government and Chinese state media, working with Russian state media, working with the influencers and Twitter like experts who really want to amplify and malign His Holiness the Dalai Lama, especially after His Holiness received the Grammy Award at age 90 for spoken word, and his teachings of compassion are resonating with the global. So I think that's part of it. The second part of the amplification is people who don't know what's going on. Like so many times when people read an article, they only read the title. They don't read the details. They don't do their own research. So when some state media really do disinformation and misinformation, that is how people start sharing it without even understanding whether it's true or not. So those are the two things why I feel like this has been amplified a lot.
Lobsang, finally, do you think there's a need of dedicated system or team to counter such a disinformation in the future? And at this stage, what is the most effective way to respond?
Yes. So I think, yes, definitely. I think in the Tibetan context, I think more and more disinformation is happening. And this is not only something that is being done in the English language space. So for example, we are seeing this in the English language. This is a global campaign by the Chinese government to malign His Holiness, and we're supported by Russian state media and individuals, right? So as we see this, I think there does need to be an understanding of how do we respond to certain things like this in a more coordinated way. It cannot be bursts and spurts, individuals doing their own, because what happens when it's not coordinated, it can also get into the space where it becomes more harmful than helpful in terms of like being able to combat disinformation. So I do feel like that is something that's needed. And this is not only with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Like, think about how many times there's disinformation about Tibet, like what the situation in Tibet is. Like, there's so many social media, like influencers, state media, which actually spreads a lot of misinformation about what's happening inside Tibet. So that's also something. At the same time, if you look at the Tibetan social media space, especially on Facebook, how many times have we seen fake accounts? Even like Meta, recently, like they have actually released 2 or 3 reports where they've actually seen Chinese state-sponsored fake accounts which are creating conflict within the Tibetan community in Tibetan language. So there have been contexts where there have been accounts, one would say something positive about His Holiness, and the same account owned by another person, like in the same structure, would say something negative about His Holiness. So trying to create conflict where there's none. So I think more and more disinformation campaigns will be run in the future, and so we need to have a more systematic approach to this. So in terms of what is happening right now, I think there's 2 aspects of it. People really need to know what is happening. People really need to understand what is inside the Jeffrey Epstein, the recently released details, because when you combat misinformation, most important thing when you need to combat misinformation is to have proper information. And you also need to understand who that person is. So for example, if it's CGTN or Russian state media or individuals or influencers who are very much connected with the Chinese government or who are very pro-China, CCP, then we need to combat them. We need to target them. Tibetans need to rise up and actually like just really basically be on social media to attack them, right? And to be really like talk about why this is fake. At the same time, there are others who don't know what's going on and who are sharing this information out of misinformation. They feel that this might be true. With those people, I think our role is to understand where they're coming from and to actually share with them the facts of what is referenced. So as I mentioned earlier, like what are the, out of the 169 or 154 references to His Holiness Dalai Lama, about 20 to 30% are mailing list information. So what is that? That's nothing to do with His Holiness or relationship. So we need to have all of those information. There are CVs, resumes, emails from journalists who are referencing His Holiness. There are people like that. So I think all of those is something that information that we need to have. Tibetans need to have that information. And then when you're combating misinformation, you need to put the facts out. So I think that is the two ways of doing it.
Lobsang, thank you so much for your insights and joining with us.
Thank you, Kesimula. So I think this is a very important discussion that we need to have, and Tibetans need to really start thinking about how more and more disinformation will happen in the Tibetan community and how we need to really be able to combat that.
So from this discussion, it's clear there's no evidence linking His Holiness Dalai Lama to the Jeffrey Epstein. Also this morning, the Office of His Holiness Dalai Lama issued an official clarification stating that His Holiness never met the Jeffrey Epstein and has never authorized any meeting or interaction with him by anyone of his behalf. The statement categorically rejects the claim as a false and misleading. The discussion also highlighted that the claims circulating online as part of deliberate and organized digital disinformation effort rooted in the Chinese government propaganda.